Okay, so wow, great. Thank you, Lane, for the wonderful, very generous introduction. It's a real treat for me to be here, not only because Professor Lei Kim is one of the idols of my academic career for a long time, but also because this is a rare opportunity for an Asianist to come and have a dialogue, hopefully a meaningful one, with Asian Americanists. So, and of course, on top of all of that, it doesn't require much to entice someone out of Michigan in late October. So I have a talk here that I hope you'll be interested in. It's a talk that bridges 1970s Korea, which was a very dark time, with the contemporary moment. And in the time today allotted to me, which is not terribly long, I really just want to be doing three main things, relatively simple things, that I hope will turn out not to be so simple after I'm done. First is to convey to you a sense of what the name Kim Ji-ha meant in the authoritarian era South Korea. Why, for example, the influential fiction writer Kim Soo-mook would recall the entire decade of the 1970s as something that boiled down to a time of war between Park Chung-hee, the dictator, and Kim Ji-ha, the poet, pure and simple. After doing that, to give you a sense of what that name Kim Ji-ha has become, especially after highly contested and even more highly contentious presidential election that took place in December 2012, and why that name Kim Ji-ha is now liable to cause people to wince rather than cheer, especially among the South Korean left. And finally, connect these 2 points in time and think about what Kim Ji-ha's so-called apostasy reveals about the political and ethical dilemma of coming to terms with the meanings of South Korea's rapid modernization, guided as it has been by the competing claims of developmentalism on the one hand and democratization on the other. I hope to complicate that those competing claims and actually present to you a thought experiment in which the democratization and developmentalism are not competing claims at all, but imbricated in a quite intimate way. So Kim Ji-ha, the symbol of democracy that was not yet in Korea during the authoritarian era, appears to have become a symptom of the peculiar democracy that has come to South Korea after formal democratization, and attending to the dilemma he poses for the South Korean left today will help us see the structural blind spots that complicate the search for imposed developmental logic as the country faces what appears to be a bewildering return of the authoritarian legacies. And those of you who keep up with the Korean news will know exactly what I'm talking about as it is unfolding in real time. Okay, so the first of my three goals, it is perhaps only natural that revolutionaries must struggle to survive the end of revolutions. But in Kim Ji-ha's case, how glorious the revolution was, and how ignominious his fall from grace. The Kim Ji-ha that I would like to remember is a dissident poet and playwright who fought Park Chung-hee throughout the 1960s and 70s, who was imprisoned multiple times, who was sentenced to death and then to life. Kim Ji-ha was the author of the scathing satire that dared to speak truth to power by calling the movers and shakers of Yushin Korea the Five Bandits. Kim Ji-ha also authored a poem with a burning thirst that would go on to become the anthem of the South Korean democratization movement in the 1980s. Kim Ji-ha, the nominee for the Nobel Prize in both literature and peace for his sustained resistance to dictatorship, and the winner of the Lotus Prize given by the Afro-Asian Writers Association in 1975, which used to be the proverbial Nobel Prize for the third world. Kim Ji-ha, who gave rise to the American feminist poet Muriel Rukeyser. Some of you might have studied her poetry in your class. Her last great work of poetry of witness. Kim Ji-ha served as a singular inspiration for Gugi Wat Yongmo's rediscovery of the power of orality in resisting the neo-colonial structures of domination in Africa. The Kim Ji-ha who fueled in Japan the great Baroque writer Nagakami Kenji's search for subaltern vitality. This Kim Ji-ha, who became a lifelong koan for the Japanese New Left intellectual Tsurumi Shunsuke, when Kim Ji-ha refused the hypocrisy of the first world defense of the third world poet's human rights. Nowhere does the power of this Kim Ji-ha come across more clearly than in his legendary performances during his many trials. Speaking on his own behalf, in the final hearing of his trial in late 1976, I apologize for the photo, which is from his trial in 1970. I could not secure one of this trial in 1976. In this trial in 1976, for example, Kim Ji-ha acknowledged that he was indeed a revolutionary as a Pak regime had charged, though not a Marxist one. In recognition of the irony, one foreigner observer of the proceeding commented, "I was struck again by the strange quality of the trial in which the defendant argues that he is innocent of violating the anti-communist law by describing his philosophy of revolution and calling for an overthrow of the government." And what a strange trial indeed this was. The prosecution's evidence were poems and plays that had yet to be written, terminal outlines of which were contained in the poet's notebooks, illegally obtained by the government. The poet's defense consisted not of making a plea for due process of law or denying the prosecution's charge of sedition at all. Rather, reframing sedition as revolution, the poet drew attention to the revolutionary potential of his ideas and maximized the aura of his ideas before a rapt audience. Since there was no press coverage allowed, the 100+ spectators who filled the benches busily took notes in trembling longhand on whatever writing surface they could find. 2 students in notebooks, an old man on a battered card, another old man inside the cover of an old book. After the trial, they would scurry away with their notes hidden in their pockets, which will resurface when they gather for discussion, quote-unquote, like a study group to decide what he said, or what he must have said. In its very manner of consumption then, Kim Ji-ha's words already foiled the Yushin state's specious demand that poetry be distinguished from politics, even as the Yushin state combed through all utterances indiscriminately for possible violations of the national security law or the numerous emergency decrees promulgated personally by the president. C. Douglas Loomis, whom I quoted in this image, a remarkably sensitive observer of the court proceedings, chose the epithet prophet for Kim Ji-ha, as though the title poet was no longer adequate for the figure at the center of the almost messianic scene that unfolded before his eyes. So, in this trial, the perversion of judicial justice in the Yushin court gave way to a scene almost reminiscent of affirmation of faith. Questions and answers, witness testimonies, and cross-examinations are in the end all rather immaterial, all hollow forms that have no bearing on the verdict already decided. As the poet embarked on his 3-hour exposition, judges drifted off to sleep or turned their faces increasingly into paper-mache masks, since they knew that they are not the intended audience for the audience of the poet's words. Placed in solitary confinement and refused visitors, the poet only has the courtroom left to make his voice heard. Preserved in bits and pieces of tattered notebooks and inside cover of a book, the poet's spoken words will be carried to the outside world and become fiery battle cries, raucous satires, heart-rending ballads, and spiritual benedictions. And in order to hear these words, people will gather. The poet's words are no longer his own. The manner of their dissemination creates numerous co-creators in a process that may itself be called collective subjectivation. Kim Ji-ha then was not simply the name of an individual writer in the 1970s, but a shorthand of literature that undergoes great expansion in a time of horrific censorship. Expansion not by extreme politics, but by expanding literature's political potentiality through and through. Kim Ji-ha rewrote the distinction between politics and poetry as a difference between, on the one hand, the dead politics of the Yushin's total war state, in which people are massified only as a target of mobilization, and the living politics of collective subjectivation under the new name of Minjung. Democracy was a name Kim gave to such politics of collective subjectivation, and the space for imagining, for working out, for proclaiming and practicing this democracy was none other than literature. So it was in recognition precisely of this that the novelist Park Tae-soon observed many years later that from Kim Ji-ha's solitary prison cell issued the Morse code signal called the passion for democracy. It was that signal which had turned literature into a battleground and positioned writers in trenches and out in the fields, demanding democracy in the very name of literature, as these numerous nights of literature that writers engaged in